I built this life, she said, standing there like the verdict was already written, like the judge just hadn't caught up yet, and I remember thinking not about the words themselves but about how easily they came out of her mouth, smooth, confident, practiced, like she'd been rehearsing them long before we ever stepped into that courtroom, and I didn't interrupt, I didn't even shift in my seat. I just let her speak because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is let someone believe their version of the story is the only one that exists, and Olivia had always been good at that, shaping narratives, choosing what people saw and what they didn't, and for years I let her, because I thought that was what marriage was supposed to look like, two people building something together even if one of them stood a little closer to the spotlight, and I didn't mind the shadows, not back then, not when the work was all that mattered. 16-hour days, 7 days a week, building a logistics company from a rented warehouse off I-35 with forklifts that broke down twice a month and contracts that barely covered payroll. I remember the smell of diesel and dust clinging to my clothes, the way my hands would ache by the end of the night, and I'd drive home in a pickup that rattled like it might fall apart any second, but every mile felt like progress, like proof that I was getting somewhere. And Olivia used to sit across from me at our small kitchen table, running numbers, asking questions, smiling like she believed in it as much as I did, and maybe she did, at least in the beginning, before the contracts got bigger, before the numbers started to change, before the house we bought turned into the house people envied, the kind with a long driveway, trimmed hedges, and neighbors who waved like they knew your name even if they didn't, and somewhere along the way the story shifted, quietly at first. The kind of shift you don't notice until it's already happened. Questions about accounts turning into questions about ownership, curiosity turning into calculation, and I told myself it was normal, that success changes people, that pressure reveals things you didn't see before. But looking back now, that was the first sign, the first crack in something I thought was solid, and I remember one night, standing in the living room while she talked about our assets, with a tone that felt just a little too precise, a little too detached, like she wasn't talking about a life we built together but something she was already preparing to separate, to divide, to claim, and I didn't argue, I didn't accuse, I just listened. Because there's a moment in every man's life when he realizes the conversation in front of him isn't really a conversation at all, it's a preview of what's coming next, and what was coming next wasn't about love, it wasn't about partnership, it was about control, and the thing about control is it doesn't show up all at once. It builds, quietly, behind the scenes, in documents, in signatures, in structures most people never think about until it's too late. And that's when I started paying attention, not to what she said, but to what she was trying to understand, what she was trying to access, what she believed she already owned, and I let her believe it, I let her talk, I let her stand there in that courtroom months later and say those words out loud. I built this life. Because the truth is, she didn't lose everything when the judge looked down at those papers, she lost it the moment she thought the story was enough, and as I sat there listening, calm, steady, my hands resting on the table like this was just another meeting, I realized something simple and absolute. She built a narrative, but I built the structure, and structures don't collapse just because someone says they own them. I did not stand up right away when she finished speaking, I did not rush to correct her, because timing matters more than volume, and the courtroom had already shifted in her favor, at least on the surface. I could feel it in the way the air settled, in the subtle nods from people who only saw what was presented to them, a confident woman, a clean narrative. A simple claim that sounded believable if you had not lived the years behind it, and that is the thing about stories, the cleaner they sound, the more they hide, and Olivia had always known how to keep things clean, how to package complexity into something people could accept without asking too many questions, and I let that play out because I needed her to go all the way, to say everything she believed out loud, not just for the judge, but for the record, for the moment that would come next, and as she spoke about long nights, about sacrifices, about decisions she said she made for the company, I found myself remembering a different set of nights entirely, nights where the office lights were still on past midnight and the parking lot outside was empty except for my truck, nights where I was signing contracts alone, negotiating terms with vendors who did not care about promises, only numbers, nights where I learned the difference between ownership and involvement, because they are not the same thing no matter how similar they look from a distance, and I remember the first time that difference became real to me. It was not dramatic, it was not a fight, it was a question, one simple question Olivia asked over dinner about how our company was structured, not how it was doing, not what we were building next, but how it was held together on paper, and I answered it the way I always did, straightforward, transparent, because at that point I still believed transparency was a form of trust that could not be misused, and she nodded, smiled, asked a few more questions. The kind that sounded casual if you did not listen too closely, but I did, and something in the way she asked them stayed with me, not enough to start a confrontation, but enough to make me pay attention, and from that moment on I started noticing patterns, small things at first, a shift in tone when money came up, a new interest in accounts she had never cared about before, the way she started keeping notes, organized, detailed, more detailed than anything she had done in the years before, and I told myself it was normal. That people evolve, that success invites new responsibilities, but there is a difference between growing into something and positioning yourself for something, and I began to understand that she was not just learning the business, she was mapping it, piece by piece, and once you see that, you cannot unsee it, you start to look at everything differently, every question, every conversation, every silence, and I did not react, not outwardly, because reacting too early closes doors you might need later. Instead I adjusted quietly, the way you reinforce a structure without announcing it, the way you add support where no one thinks to look, and it started with a call to an attorney I had not spoken to in years. A man who did not deal in assumptions, only in outcomes, and I sat across from him in an office that smelled like old paper and polished wood, and I laid everything out, not accusations, just facts, patterns, concerns that had not yet turned into problems but could if left alone, and he listened the way professionals do, without interruption, without judgment, and when I finished he leaned back and said something simple that stayed with me. He said, "Ownership is not what you say, it is what you can prove. And more importantly, it is what you can protect," and that was the moment the situation stopped being emotional and started being strategic, because I realized I was not dealing with a disagreement, I was dealing with a future claim, one that would not be argued in a living room but decided in a place exactly like the one I was sitting in now, and once you see that path clearly, you either prepare for it, or you become part of it, and I chose to prepare, quietly, deliberately, without changing anything on the surface, because the strongest positions are the ones no one sees until they are already in place, and as Olivia's voice echoed through the courtroom, confident, certain, I knew she was standing on a version of reality that no longer existed, not because I had taken anything from her, but because I had already secured what mattered long before this moment ever arrived. The first time I moved something off the main ledger, it did not feel like a betrayal, it felt like maintenance, the kind you do when you notice a weak point before it becomes a failure, and I remember sitting in that same attorney's office with a yellow legal pad in front of me, listing everything we had built, not just the company but the structure around it, the accounts, the properties, the agreements that most people never think about until they are forced to, and he did not rush me, he let me talk through it piece by piece until the pattern was clear, and when it was, he did not suggest anything dramatic, no sudden moves, no aggressive tactics, just quiet adjustments, the kind that change outcomes without changing appearances. And that was exactly what I needed because I was not trying to win an argument, I was preparing for a situation that had not happened yet but was already taking shape, and the first step was simple in theory but precise in execution, separating control from visibility, making sure that what appeared shared was not necessarily owned in the way it could be claimed later, and that is where most people make mistakes. They assume ownership is obvious, that it sits plainly in front of you, but in reality it lives in documents, in timing, in signatures placed years before anyone questions them, and I followed his guidance. Carefully, not all at once, not in a way that would raise suspicion, but gradually, over months, adjusting the framework of everything I had built, transferring certain interests into a trust that carried my family name, restructuring the company so that operational control did not automatically equal ownership, creating layers that were not designed to hide anything illegal but to clarify what was already true. That the foundation had always been mine even if the presentation looked shared. And through all of it I never changed how I acted at home. I still answered questions, still explained things when Olivia asked, still let her believe she was catching up to something she thought she had been part of all along, and that was the hardest part, not the legal work, not the meetings or the paperwork, but the patience, the discipline of not reacting when it would have been easier to confront. Because confrontation gives the other person a chance to adjust, to prepare, and I needed her to stay exactly where she was, confident, certain, unaware of the shift happening beneath the surface. And there were moments when I questioned it, not the strategy but the situation itself, how we had gotten there, how a partnership turned into something that required this level of planning, and I would look at her across the room, talking about future plans, about expansion, about what we were going to do next, and I could hear the difference in the way she used that word. It was no longer about building together, it was about positioning herself within what had already been built. And that is when the last piece fell into place for me, because I realized this was not temporary, it was not a phase, it was a direction, and once someone chooses that direction, they do not turn back, they follow it all the way through, and that meant I had to be ready not just for a conversation but for a claim, a formal one, backed by confidence and presentation, the kind that could persuade people who only saw the surface. And as I finalized the last set of documents, as the trust was fully executed and the ownership lines were no longer open to interpretation, I understood something clearly. Nothing had been taken from her, nothing had been hidden in a dishonest way, I had simply defined what was already true before anyone tried to redefine it for me, and sitting there now in that courtroom, listening to her finish her statement, I felt none of the anger people expect in moments like this, no impulse to interrupt or correct her mid-sentence. Just a steady certainty that everything she was building her case on no longer had a foundation to stand on, and when my attorney finally placed his hand lightly on the folder in front of us, a quiet signal that it was time, I knew the moment had arrived not because of what I was about to say, but because of everything I had already done long before this day ever came. My attorney did not rush when he opened the folder, and that was intentional, because moments like that are not about speed, they are about control. And control is established long before a single word is spoken. It is in the preparation, in the patience, in the willingness to let the other side believe they are ahead, and I sat there with my hands folded, watching as he carefully slid the first document across the table. Not toward Olivia, not even toward the judge at first, but into the center, where it existed as a fact before it became an argument, and I could feel the shift begin, subtle, almost invisible, the kind of shift you only notice if you are paying attention, and Olivia was not yet, she was still standing in the certainty of everything she had just said, her posture steady, her expression composed, the same confidence that had carried her through her entire statement. And for a second I wondered if she would recognize what was happening. Before anyone explained it, if she would see the difference between what she believed and what was about to be shown, but certainty has a way of narrowing your vision. It makes you focus on what supports you and ignore what does not, and that is exactly where she was, focused on her version of the story, not the structure underneath it. And when the judge finally looked down at the document, adjusted his glasses, and began to read, the room changed in a way that had nothing to do with sound. It was quieter, but not because anyone had spoken, it was quieter because attention had shifted, because the weight of the moment had moved from words to proof. And that is where things become real, not in what is said, but in what can be verified. And I remember the first line being read, the name of the trust, Carter Family Holdings, established years before any of this had surfaced. And I saw the smallest flicker in Olivia's expression, not confusion yet, not concern, just a brief pause, like her mind was trying to place something it had not expected to hear, and my attorney continued calm, precise, explaining the structure in terms that left no room for interpretation, how the primary assets, the company's shares, the properties, the accounts that appeared joint were in fact held under that trust, how control had been defined, documented, and executed long before any claim was made. And I did not look at her, not then, because this was not about watching her reaction, it was about allowing the reality to settle, to be understood fully without interruption. And as the explanation unfolded, I could feel the difference between belief and fact becoming clear in the room, not dramatic, not explosive, just undeniable, the kind of clarity that does not need emphasis. And I thought back to the day those documents were signed, the quiet office, the deliberate pace, the understanding that this was not about winning something in the moment but protecting something over time. And that is the part most people miss. They think outcomes are decided in rooms like this, under pressure, under scrutiny. But the truth is they are decided long before, in smaller rooms, in quieter moments when no one is watching, when the choices you make do not feel urgent but end up being everything. And as the judge turned the page, asked a question, received a straightforward answer, I knew there was no argument that could change what was already in place, no interpretation that could undo what had been clearly defined, and for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to breathe a little differently, not with relief, not with satisfaction, but with a steady acknowledgement that the process had reached its point, that everything leading up to this moment had aligned exactly as it needed to. And when the judge finally looked up, not at me, but at Olivia, and asked if her counsel had reviewed these documents prior to the hearing, there was a pause that said more than any response could, because in that pause was the realization that the story she had built did not match the structure she was standing on. And structures do not bend for stories, they hold, exactly as they were designed to. The pause stretched just long enough for everyone in the room to understand that something had shifted, not in a dramatic way, not with raised voices or sudden reactions, but in that quiet, unmistakable way when certainty begins to unravel and reality takes its place. And I finally looked at Olivia, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of clarity that had taken months to build. Because this moment was never about catching her off guard, it was about letting the truth stand on its own, and for the first time since she started speaking, she did not look composed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who did not know her the way I did, but I saw it in the way her eyes shifted, and the way her posture adjusted just slightly, like someone recalculating in real time, trying to find footing on ground that no longer felt stable. And her attorney leaned in, whispering something quick, something strategic. But strategy only works when the foundation supports it, and this foundation had already been defined, documented, secured long before this conversation ever began. And the judge did not rush either. He flipped through the pages carefully, methodically, asking questions that were not aggressive but precise, questions that did not challenge emotion but clarified structure. And that is where everything becomes clear, because structure does not respond to emotion, it responds to definition, to timing, to execution. And every answer my attorney gave was steady, supported, leaving no gaps to reinterpret, no space for assumptions, and I could see the difference now. Not just in Olivia, but in the entire room, the way attention had shifted fully, no longer centered on what had been claimed but on what could be proven. And I remembered something my father used to say when I was younger, working beside him on small jobs that felt bigger than they were at the time. He said if you build something right, you do not have to defend it later, it will stand on its own. And sitting there, listening to the quiet exchange between attorneys and the judge, I realized that was exactly what was happening. Nothing needed to be defended because everything had already been established. And Olivia finally spoke again, her voice still controlled but different now, not as certain, asking questions about timing, about intent, about why she had not been informed. And that was the moment I understood the shift completely. Because the conversation had moved from ownership to awareness, from claiming something to trying to understand why it was never truly hers to claim. And I did not interrupt, I did not step in to explain, because this was not my place to argue. It was my place to let the structure speak, and structures do not explain themselves, they simply exist. And the more she spoke, the clearer it became that she had built her case on an assumption. One that felt real because it had never been challenged before. But assumptions do not hold up when examined closely, not in a room like this, not under this kind of scrutiny. And I thought back to all the moments leading up to this, the questions, the notes, the subtle shifts that I had noticed but never confronted directly, and I realized that confronting them would not have changed anything. It would have only accelerated this moment without the preparation that made it final. And when the judge finally set the documents down, looked up with a measured expression, and began summarizing what had been presented, there was no tension in his voice, no dramatic tone, just a clear acknowledgement of what the documents established, and that clarity was more powerful than any argument, because it removed interpretation entirely. And as he spoke, outlining the structure, the timing, the legal standing of everything that had been put in place, I saw Olivia's certainty fade into something else, not confusion exactly, but recognition, the kind that comes when the story you believed no longer aligns with the reality in front of you. And in that moment, I did not feel victorious. I did not feel justified. I felt something simpler, something quieter, the understanding that this was never about taking anything away. It was about making sure that what was built could not be rewritten by someone who only understood the surface. And as the room settled into that new understanding, I remained exactly where I had been from the beginning, calm, steady, letting the outcome unfold not because of what I said, but because of everything that had already been done. There is a moment in every courtroom where the outcome stops being a question and becomes a formality, not because a decision has been announced, but because every piece has already fallen into place, and I could feel that moment settling in as the judge finished outlining the structure, his voice steady, deliberate, leaving no room for interpretation. And what stood out was not the complexity of what had been built, but the simplicity of what it meant, that ownership had been defined long before any dispute, that intent had been documented in a way that could not be reversed by assumption or presentation, and I saw Olivia sitting there, still composed on the surface, still holding on to that last thread of control, but something fundamental had shifted. The certainty that carried her into this room was no longer supporting her, and when she spoke again it was different. Not defensive, not emotional, but searching. Asking questions that were no longer about proving a claim, but about understanding how the claim had already been resolved without her realizing it, and that is the part people rarely talk about, not the outcome, not the ruling, but the realization, the quiet recognition that everything you thought you could rely on was never actually structured the way you believed. And I listened without interruption, not because I did not have anything to say, but because anything I could say would have been unnecessary at that point. The documents had already done the work, the structure had already spoken. And there's a certain discipline in knowing when silence carries more weight than explanation, and as her attorney shifted strategies, moving from ownership to contribution, from control to involvement, I understood exactly what was happening. They were trying to reframe the narrative into something that could still hold value, something that could still justify a claim even if the original argument no longer stood. And in another situation that might have worked, but contribution without defined ownership does not create entitlement, it creates participation, and participation does not override structure, it exists within it, and that distinction, small as it sounds, is what separates what people believe from what is legally recognized. And I thought back to the early days again, not with regret, not with resentment, but with a kind of clarity that only comes after everything has been tested. Because in those days the lines were not as important, the focus was on building, on growth, on moving forward, and maybe that is where the misunderstanding began, in the assumption that shared effort automatically meant shared ownership, and I do not blame her entirely for that, because from the outside it looked that way, it felt that way, but feeling is not the same as defining. And that is a lesson most people do not learn until they are forced to. And as the discussion continued, as the judge asked final clarifying questions and both sides responded within the boundaries that had already been established, the path forward became clearer, not because it was announced, but because there were no longer any competing interpretations strong enough to challenge what had been presented. And I realized something in that moment that surprised even me. I was not thinking about what I would gain from this. I was thinking about what had been preserved, not just the company, not just the assets, but the integrity of what had been built, the intention behind it, the structure that ensured it would continue the way it was meant to. And when the judge finally leaned back slightly, signaling that he had heard enough, that he had what he needed to move forward, the room settled into a quiet that felt different from before, not tense, not uncertain, but resolved. And I remained exactly as I had been from the beginning, steady, composed, not because I was unaffected, but because everything that mattered had already been secured long before anyone walked into this room. And as I glanced once more at Olivia, I did not see an opponent. I saw someone coming to terms with a reality that had been there all along, just not in the form she expected, and that is the difference between building something and believing you built it. One is defined over time, in structure and intent. The other exists only as long as it goes unchallenged, and once it is challenged, only one of them remains. When the judge finally called for a brief recess before delivering the formal ruling, the room did not erupt into movement the way people might expect. There was no sudden rush, no dramatic reactions, just a quiet release of tension that had been building beneath the surface, and I remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, not because I needed time, but because I understood something that most people in that room did not. That the outcome had already happened. This pause was not a break in the process, it was simply the final space before everything became official, and I watched as Olivia stood, her attorney speaking to her in low, controlled tones, likely recalibrating, adjusting expectations, explaining what the documents meant in practical terms, not in theory, but in consequence, and I could see the difference now more clearly than before, not in her posture or her expression alone, but in the absence of something that had been there from the beginning, that absolute certainty. It was gone, replaced by something more measured, more aware, and there is a particular weight that comes with that kind of realization. It does not show itself loudly, it settles, it reshapes the way a person holds themselves, the way they look at everything around them, and I had seen it before, in business, in negotiations, in moments when someone realizes they are no longer in control of the outcome. Not because they failed, but because they misunderstood the structure they were operating within, and I stood slowly, adjusting my jacket out of habit more than necessity, and for the first time since this began, Olivia looked directly at me, not through me, not past me, but at me, and there was no accusation in that look, no anger, just a question that did not need to be spoken, and I did not answer it, because the answer was already there, in everything that had been presented. In every document, every signature, every decision made long before this room ever became part of the story, and for a brief moment we stood there in that shared silence, not as opponents, not even as partners anymore, but as two people who had arrived at the same point from completely different understandings of how they got there, and I turned away first, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing left to resolve between us in that space. Everything that needed to be said had already been established. And I stepped into the hallway where the atmosphere felt different, less controlled, more human, the low hum of conversations, the shuffle of footsteps, the distant echo of other cases unfolding in parallel, and my attorney joined me a few seconds later, his expression steady, not celebratory, not overly serious, just professional, the way someone looks when a plan has unfolded exactly as intended, and he did not offer reassurance, he did not say we had won, because that was not the kind of work he did. Instead he simply nodded once and said the structure held, and that was enough, because that was always the goal, not to defeat someone, not to prove a point, but to ensure that what had been built could not be redefined by interpretation. And as we stood there, waiting for the next call back into the courtroom, I found my mind drifting, not to the outcome that was about to be finalized, but to the path that led here, the decisions made quietly, the restraint practiced consistently, the understanding that sometimes the strongest move is the one no one sees until it is already complete, and when the bailiff finally called us back in, the room felt smaller somehow, not physically, but in terms of what was left unresolved, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to reinterpret, only the formal acknowledgement of what had already been established, and as I took my seat again, calm, steady, exactly as I had been from the beginning, I knew that whatever words came next would not change the outcome, they would simply give it a voice. When the judge returned and took his seat, the room settled into a silence that felt different from before, not tense, not uncertain, but final, the kind of silence that carries weight because everyone in it understands that what comes next is not a debate, it is a conclusion, and I sat there with the same steady posture I had held from the beginning, not because I was trying to appear composed, but because there was nothing left to adjust, nothing left to prepare for. Everything that mattered had already been set in place long before this moment, and when he began to speak, his voice was measured, deliberate, not dramatic, not rushed, just clear, outlining the structure once more, confirming what had already been presented, that the assets in question were held under the Carter Family Holdings Trust, that the timing of its establishment preceded any claim brought forward, that the documentation reflected intent and execution in a way that left no ambiguity, and I watched as each sentence landed, not like a blow, but like a piece of reality being set firmly into place. And Olivia remained still, listening, her expression controlled but no longer anchored in the certainty she had carried into this room, and I realized something in that moment that felt almost quiet in its significance. This was not a collapse, not a dramatic fall, it was a correction, a realignment between what was believed and what actually existed, and those are two very different things, because belief can stretch, it can adapt, it can survive on assumptions, but structure does not, it holds exactly as it was defined, nothing more, nothing less. And as the judge continued, addressing the claims, the arguments, the attempts to reframe contribution into ownership, it became clear that there was no path for that argument to succeed within the framework that had been established, and I felt no surge of victory, no moment of triumph, just a steady acknowledgement that the process had reached its natural conclusion. And when he finally stated the decision in plain terms, confirming that the assets remained under the trust, that no ownership claim could override that structure, that any further considerations would be limited to what had been clearly defined within that framework, it did not feel like something new. It felt like something already known being spoken out loud, and that is the difference between winning something and confirming something. One feels sudden, the other feels inevitable, and this had always been inevitable from the moment the structure was set, even if it took time for that reality to surface. And I glanced once more at Olivia, not out of habit, not out of curiosity, but because I wanted to understand how this moment existed for her, and what I saw was not defeat, not anger, but recognition, the kind that settles slowly, the kind that does not explode but lingers, reshaping everything that came before it. And I thought back to the beginning, to the first time she asked about ownership, to the questions that seemed small at the time, to the decisions I made quietly in response, and I understood now that those moments were not separate from this one, they were part of it, building toward it in ways that were not obvious until everything connected. And as the judge concluded, as the formalities were completed, as the room began to shift from stillness into motion, I did not feel the need to say anything, not to her, not to anyone. Because the outcome did not belong to a conversation anymore, it belonged to the structure that had carried it here. And I stood, adjusted my jacket once more out of habit, and prepared to leave not with a sense of closure in the emotional sense, but with a clear understanding that what had been built had held exactly as it was meant to, not because it was defended in this room, but because it was defined long before anyone tried to challenge it. The hallway outside the courtroom felt brighter than I remembered, not because the lights were any different, but because something had shifted internally, the kind of shift that does not announce itself but changes how everything is perceived. And I walked past the rows of wooden benches, past people waiting for their own cases, their own outcomes, their own moments of realization, and for the first time since this began, there was no weight pressing forward, no anticipation, no need to think. Several steps ahead, just a steady sense of completion that did not feel loud or overwhelming, just quiet and certain. And I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped outside where the late afternoon sun hit the pavement, warm, consistent, unchanged by anything that had just taken place inside, and that contrast stayed with me. How something so significant in one space could mean nothing in another. How the world continues exactly as it was regardless of personal outcomes. And I took a slow breath, not to steady myself, but because there was finally space to do it without thinking about what came next. And my attorney stepped out beside me a moment later, offering a brief nod before heading off toward the parking lot, his role complete, his work done, and I watched him go without saying anything more, because everything that needed to be communicated between us had already been understood without words, and I stood there for a moment longer, looking out across the street where traffic moved in steady lines, people going about their day without any awareness of what had just concluded a few feet away. And I thought about the years behind me, the long hours, the decisions made quietly, the adjustments that seemed small at the time but carried weight far beyond their moment. And I realized something simple that I had not fully put into words. Before, building something is not just about creating it, it is about defining it in a way that can withstand being challenged, Because sooner or later everything is challenged, not always in a courtroom, not always in a formal setting, but in conversations, in assumptions, in the way people interpret what they see from the outside, and if what you built only exists in perception, it can be rewritten, it can be claimed. It can be reshaped by someone else's narrative, but if it exists in structure, in clear, intentional design, then it holds, not because you defend it, but because it was never ambiguous to begin with. And I started walking toward my truck, the same model I had driven years ago, when everything was still uncertain, still in motion, still forming into something that did not yet have a name or a presence. And as I reached for the door handle, I paused for just a second, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because this moment was not an ending in the way most people think. It was not a clean break or a dramatic conclusion. It was simply a point of transition, where one phase of understanding gives way to another, and I knew that whatever came next would not look the same as what came before, not because something had been lost, but because something had been clarified, and clarity has a way of changing direction without forcing it. And I got into the truck, closed the door, and sat there for a moment with my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, the engine still off, the quiet inside matching the quiet I felt, and I thought about Olivia, not with resentment, not with judgment, but with a kind of distance that only comes after everything has settled, and I understood that her version of the story had not been entirely false, it had just been incomplete, built on what she saw, what she experienced, without the full structure underneath it, and that difference, small as it seems, is what separates belief from reality. And I started the engine, the familiar sound grounding, steady, and as I pulled out of the parking lot, merging into the flow of traffic, there was no sense of looking back, no need to revisit what had already been resolved, just a clear road ahead and the understanding that what I had built was not just something that existed, it was something that endured, not because it was protected in the moment, but because it had been defined long before anyone tried to rewrite it.